If you search on YouTube types versus interfaces, you will see that almost everyone will tell you that types are better than interfaces, and they recommend that you use types all the time. And some of them even go further and say that interfaces are a mistake in the language and the documentation. So let's debunk all this misinformation together. Hello my friends, I'm Mark Maxey, and in this channel I help you create web applications from code to production. If this sounds interesting for you, consider subscribing to my channel to get notified about more videos like this in the future, and also to support my channel and the YouTube algorithm. So let's talk about interfaces in TypeScript. Now, if you ask any web developer about the usage and how to use interfaces, most likely you will hear this common answer that interfaces are a way to define types for objects. Although that is true, but what if I told you that the real purpose and the real intention of creating interfaces is not to define types for objects? I know that sounds very weird because everyone on the internet tells you otherwise. They tell you that interfaces are used to define types for objects. And they also even go further and say that interfaces versus types, and they start to compare these two things together and say that types are better than interfaces because they have XYZ features and interfaces don't have these features. So you should use types all the time. But by comparing types with interfaces, you are actually comparing oranges to apples. And by doing that, you are actually committing a logical fallacy, because these two things are not the same. In order to compare two things, they should share the same properties, the same purpose, but the purpose of interface and the purpose of type is completely different. And in order to understand interfaces, actually, you need to understand object-oriented programming. The reason is because interfaces is a concept that is specific and explicit to object-oriented programming. So in order to understand interfaces, you need to apply it in object-oriented programming. And since most web frameworks now, especially in front-end development, like React and Nest.js, they are shifting towards using hooks, and hooks are functions. And since all developers now are locked in these frameworks, and these frameworks allow you to use hooks, which are functions, all the time. You rarely use classes in front-end development. So it's very common to think that, yeah, that is the real purpose or the only purpose of interfaces. But actually, that is not true. So I want to show you the real power or the real and hidden power of interfaces using object-oriented programming. Even if you go to documentation and look for interfaces, documentation tells you, yeah, that interfaces are a way to define types for objects. But the point is that documentation is not a learning platform, and it is not a university or a boot camp or a book to learn how to build applications or to learn design patterns, for example. The documentation is just a way to learn the syntax of the language. So that's it. That's why they don't tell you how to use interfaces in programs, because that is not the purpose of documentations, right? So I want to show you now a simple application or simple program that has this class, which is called user. We have this class user, and that has only one method, which is called get user profile, and the purpose of it is to call this API and fetch the user data from that API. So let's go to this API on my browser. Okay, I want to give it ID of 1, and if you see, I have this response. So email, name, username, something like that. So I have this URL, and I call the Axios method get this URL and take that data and return it. And also in the index, I have instantiated that class, which is called user, into this user object. And if I call user dot get user profile, okay, I should give it a number, which is number 1. And also I want to log the data. just to see it in the console. npm start, and we see the data. So our application is working fine. Now let's see what happens if I decided to make my code even better. Now the fetching data logic, which is axios.get URL and converting that to JSON, or extracting the data from the response, all of that is not the responsibility of this user class. So in order to follow the concept of separation of concerns, I need to isolate this. Okay, I need to isolate all this logic into a different class. I want to create another class called, let's create a folder called services. And inside the services, I want to create something called http service.ts. And here I want to create a class called http service and define a constructor. And then we define get data. Okay, this get data is an async function because I want to call the API. And let's import the Axios library. We have the URL. It should accept an URL of string. Okay. And now we have the logic of fetching data inside a different class. So in order to get the user data from the index, for example, by calling user.getUserProfile, now it doesn't do anything because there is no return, nothing. So in order to create this relationship between the user and the HTTP service, I have multiple options. I have two options. The first one is inheritance. Inheritance is inheriting methods and properties from other classes. So I can say that this class, extend this class, and by doing that, I inherit all the properties and all the methods defined in this class. But that is not a good way of doing program, because in inheritance, okay, I usually have this kind of relationship, which is relationship between an animal and a dog. Okay, animal and a dog. So a dog is an animal. So I have this form of relationship, which is a relationship, okay, or is an animal. But in my case, user is HTTP service. No, that doesn't make sense, because user is not HTTP service. We might say admin is a user. Yeah, that is inheritance. But in my case, it doesn't make sense to say user is HTTP service. So I can't use inheritance here, or it's not recommended to use inheritance in this case. The recommended approach is to use something called composition. In composition, we have something like, in our case, user and some service, or in this case, HTTP service. So the relationship is user has a HTTP service. Okay, so when you have the has a relationship or have a relationship, you build using composition. So what is composition? Composition is simply delegating logic from one class to another class. So that's what we have already done. We delegated the logic of fetching data from an API from this class, which is user, to this class, okay, using this method. So that's the first step. We delegate the logic. The second step is to create or establish a relationship between the two classes. So in order to tell TypeScript that user has a relationship between with HTTP service class, I need to use interfaces. Now there are other ways to do that, but I want to do it using interfaces. So let's define an interface here. Okay, I want to define an interface called access database. And this interface has this method, okay, which is a function that returns, let's return a promise. For now, I want to say t. Now, if you don't know what this t is, it's a generic. And if you don't know what generics are, you can check out my other video tutorial about generics. But for the purpose of this video, it doesn't matter. I just write it for the syntax, and that's it. So now we have this access database interface, which has a function called getData, which is a function that accepts a URL of any string and returns a promise. So now I want to tell TypeScript that HTTP service class should implement access database interface. And by doing that, I create a bond between the interface and the class. So in some way, if I define some function that is not appropriate, like get dot instead of with data, I get an error saying that this function is not correct. So I need to write something that implements this interface, which is get data. So that is the first, let's say, that is the first purpose of interfaces, is to create a blueprint for classes to define how these classes should be called or should be defined, let's say. So here it's a blueprint for classes. And now let's see how to create this relationship between the user and the HTTP service using this interface. To create that relationship, I want to export the interface. And here I want to, for example, in the constructor, I want to provide a private property called, let's say it's called HTTP service. The type of this is access database. Okay, access database is an interface. And now what happens is whenever I want to instantiate the user class, as we already done inside the index.ts, whenever I want to instantiate this class, I have to provide some object, and this object has to comply and implements all the properties of access database interface. What kind of classes that implement access database? We have different ones. We have HTTP service. We might define something else like GraphQL service. For example, I can define another class. For example, I can define another class. Let's say it's called GraphQL service. And also it implements the access database interface. And since it implements that interface, it has to satisfy its properties and methods. So I want to define another method called getData, but with different logic. I'm not going to write any logic. Okay, I need to return some promise. So let's suppose it has the same thing, but of course that is not true. But let's suppose that this is a GraphQL logic. Okay, that is not true because actually it actually calls the RESTful API. It's not a GraphQL API, but let's suppose that it is a GraphQL API and I'm calling some query on that API. So anyway, it doesn't matter that much, but what matters to me is when I want to instantiate the user class, I have to provide one argument, and that argument, if you remember, that argument has to be satisfying all the properties and methods defined in the access database interface. And the two classes that implements the access database interface are HTTP service or GraphQL service. So what I can do now is create something like const service equals new HTTP service, Okay, and pass this service to this user, and that's it. And now what happens is I created a bond or a relationship between the user class and the HTTP service class, or maybe the GraphQL class. So because both of them implements the same interface. So in any time in the future, if I decided that this user has to work with a different service, I simply create another service like what? Like GraphQL service. Okay, and pass that service 2. I can pass service 1, I can pass service 2. So it's very flexible. So that is the purpose of using interfaces in this case, to create a relationship or to create a composition. So I want to here write number 2, that is the benefit number 2 of interfaces, which is composition. Okay, or delegating logic. Okay, by doing that, we delegate the logic from one class to another class. And what else? Now what we can do is, instead of defining all the logic of calling the fetching the user data from the API inside this method, I can simply write this dot HTTP service dot get data. Okay, and I need to define a URL, and that's it. I don't need to know anything about the implementation of this function. This method might have different logic. It might have error handling. I don't care. Okay, all I care about is whenever someone calls this method, I just have to pass it some URL and the method will work just fine. It will work all the logic inside this hidden layer. You see here, it's a hidden layer in the services directory. I don't care about the implementation. Okay, it's not a problem to me. It might call the database, might have an errors, handle the errors, or do whatever it wants to do. I don't care. So what I can do now is go back here. Okay, I can call user dot get user profile, and I need to pass it a number like number 1, and let's see what happens if I run my application. npm start. Let's wait until okay, we got all the data from the API as expected, and it works fine. Okay, so far we've talked about 2 of the real superpowers of interfaces in TypeScript that almost no one talks about on YouTube. The first one is that interfaces act as a blueprint for classes. For example, in this HTTP service class, it implements an interface called access database. And if I decided to write something gibberish here, like get data, ASDA, I get an error saying that this method name does not exist in this interface. So I need to change that to something more meaningful, which is get data. And what else? We've seen also the real superpower of interfaces in composition. And we talked about it earlier, that composition is simply delegating logic from one object or from one class to another class. And in this example, the logic was fetching data from an API and converting that data to JSON. I don't care about the implementation of that logic inside my user class, because all I care about is returning a user. Okay, that's all I care about. So I isolated the logic from the user class to the HTTP service class, if you remember, in this method, and created a bond or created a relationship between this user and this HTTP service by using the interface. Okay, and defining that interface here, access database in the constructor. And now whenever I want to call the user class, I already told you that, okay, if I decide to call user2, I have to pass a meaningful and correct object. I cannot pass any object. I cannot pass any value. Okay, if I decided to pass an object of name Mark, for example, I will get an error because this object does not satisfy the rules that I already defined in my interface. Okay, because I said that whatever works with this user class has to satisfy the rules defined in the interface called access database. And also here, I need to change it to something more meaningful, like, for example, service 1. Okay, if I decided to work with some other service, like a GraphQL service, sorry, I pass it service 2, and it works just as expected. And what is different is just the implementation. GraphQL, HTTP server. I don't care about the implementation. It happens behind the scenes. All I care about is that I can call get user profile with some ID or user ID, and I get a user. That's all I care about. So that is the real superpower of interfaces in TypeScript. Now, whenever someone tells you that you should use types all the time and that interfaces are a mistake in the language or some crap like that, you can share that video with them. Tell them, yeah, you go learn something about interfaces, because they are not simply just types for objects. They are way more than that. And I hope this video was helpful for you. And if it was helpful, I really appreciate it if you click on the like button and subscribe to my channel to support me and to support the algorithm. And also, it would be really awesome if you share this video with your friends and your social media network so that I can reach more people with this enlightening knowledge of interfaces in TypeScript. So I'm done for the day and I'm going to sleep because I'm really tired. Yesterday I was working on a project for 13 hours straight. So I need to get some rest, and until then, take care of yourselves and see you very soon.